So thank you, Reverend Dr. John Williams Walker, for having us here at St Eanswythe and the community here who welcomed us. So, breath and water, blood and bones. Well, the blood comes from William Harvey, who in the 17th century discovered the circulation of the blood, which we'll be hearing more about. Water. St Eanswythe's miracle was to make fresh water flow uphill to her priory, adjacent to this building. And bones, St Eanswythe's bones, have an amazing story, as you're going to hear. Well, breath is something we've all been perhaps more conscious of than ever during the time of the pandemic. The breath that we all think is a good thing suddenly became dangerous and a bit frightening. So, and such things as gathering and singing weren't possible. So today we're going to do some breathing, and I think we're going to do some singing. We're going to do some singing too. So breath and water, blood and bones. These are some of the things we're going to explore about today. So let me introduce them. Lesley Hardy, historian, Sarah Montgomery, doctor, and Grenville Hancox, musician. Maybe I could just ask you each to say a tiny bit about what we're going to talk about, and then we'll move on to the first presentation. Okay, Sarah, would you like to?
Thank you, Joanna. Yes. So, as a doctor, it falls to me really to talk about William Harvey, and inevitably from a medical perspective. So I hope to be able to share some of my views as to why he was really such a genius and how we are still not just grateful to him, but directly linked with what he discovered today.
Afternoon, everyone. So, as Joanna has said, we're thinking about art and we're thinking about experience and personal response to art in Triennial and about how that resonates in society. So I am going to be talking about history, but I'm also, forgive me, going to be talking a little bit about personal responses to history and what they mean, because I think by that means we can actually achieve a better and deeper understanding of the practice of history itself, and also in particular of the significance of St Eanswythe.
Hi everybody. I'm going to talk about the thing that actually binds us all together, and that's you as human beings, and actually the breath that sustains you, and the fact that the breath that sustains you actually allows you to sing. And when we sing, we demonstrate our humanity.
So if you'd like to welcome our panel, we'll get going.
Thank you very much. I'm going to not use the microphone unless you find it difficult to hear me. I want you to actually just recall a moment that we all shared in our life. That's coming out of the womb. When we came out of the womb, we sang our first song. Ah! 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 And that first song actually was a reflection of the fact that we took our first breath outside the womb. So breath associated with sound, and that sound actually, that song actually making the point that I am here. I am here. In that way. We all have that, I'm assuming in an audience that at the moment that we're all able to hear and able to speak, because I've never met you before, so I don't know your individual circumstances, but I'm going to assume that. So what I'd like you to do is actually just alter your posture fractionally so that you move away your back from the sustaining element of the pew. Yes, that way. And just move your shoulders slightly. And just move your neck just very gently. And normally I would be encouraging you to actually breathe out by going, I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to turn away though. I'm going to go, ha! Like that. If I ask you to do that though, there's too many, what's they called? Deodorants, aerosols. Deodorants, that's it, too many deodorants. Too many aerosols coming out. Yep. So what I'd just like you to do is actually just, I'm going to ask you to laugh, first of all. So I'm going to go, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to go, and I want you to join in. Ready? Okay, at the same time, put your hand on your diaphragm, on your tummy here, and do exactly the same. Ready? Okay, you're probably feeling the movement there. That movement is actually the whole mechanism that's involved to support your voice. We're making a sound there. Somehow, it's a miracle. Like that. Air, breath, sustaining, a column of air coming through the vocal tract, the vocal cords that will be enlivened in that way. So we're all able to use our diaphragm and our vocal cords. I'm going to ask you to say this, Bella Mama. Bella Mama.
Bella Mama.
Can you say it, please?
Bella Mama.
And I say it and smile at me. Go.
Bella Mama.
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Can you do that?
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey.
Okay, and smile at the same time. Here you go again.
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey.
Line 1. Line 2. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Listen. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Try that.
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey.
Right, we're going to do line 1 and line 2. So line 1 is Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. It goes into line 2, which goes Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Okay, line 1, here we go.
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey.
Lovely. Line 3. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama. Try it.
Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama.
Fourth line. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Anybody notice any similarity between line 4 and line 1? Exactly. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Okay, line 3. Bella Mama, here. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Very good. Okay, we're going to go right through. 4 lines, okay? Just check your posture. Have to smile. You don't mind smiling. And be aware of what's happening when you are singing. What's happening to your breath as you're singing? Just start to sort of connect that. A connection between, just make the connection between your brain and your diaphragm in that way. See where we're connected. Okay, here we go. And go. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Line 2. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, hey. Lovely. Line 3. Bella Mama, Bella Mama, Bella Mama, actually. Lovely. Okay, let's sing that again. Just now really sort of feel that your whole being is with your voice. Notice as well, I haven't told you anything about the pitch. I haven't told you anything about the pulse, which is underneath there. So here's the link between, if you like, Harvey and your breath. That we know now where this is, how central this is to our being. That's the pulse that we're using. Here we go. Line 1. Bell mama, hey. Second. Bell mama, hey. Third. Bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, hey. Brilliant. Okay, once again. Bell mama, hey. Line 2. Bell mama, hey. 3. Bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, bell mama, hey. Good, this side, go. Bell mama, hey. Bell mama, hey. Bell mama, hey. Brilliant, this side, go. Bell mama, tingles all over me, that sort of my flesh is reacting to you because you've made harmony. Yeah, that amazing thing. So that's rare. Well, congratulations. We could actually do even more parts, which we do later on. Thank you. And we're on.
Well, should we go to Sarah now?
No.
Oh, I don't know. Did he?
It's up to you.
Well, I think you're... I don't know. Yes, I think you're on, actually.
Okay.
If it's not too much of you.
Okay. Okay. So, congratulations. What I want to just link up really is the pure majesty of what we've just done in terms of actually demonstrating us being human. We take it for granted in a sense that we have a mechanism to be able to speak unless we can't speak. Unless we have to go to Sarah say, I can't speak, something's wrong with it. We take it for granted then, as an extension of that we can sing, although there are so many different things that are associated now with singing, which are about acculturation. And if we were in a different place on the planet right now, then we wouldn't be perhaps responding in a different way to the use of the voice in singing. Dependent upon the culture that we occupy. So acculturation impacts upon what I'm saying too. So I just want to look at this whole idea of where we've come from, because as brilliant and as magnificent as both William Harvey and his predecessor St Eanswythe are as individuals, our ancestry is far greater and longer in arriving at the point where St Eanswythe's down the road here, William Harvey's a little, well, close by too, being born here. So we just had to accommodate this whole idea that in the last 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, we've been catapulted into knowing things that we didn't know before. But what has gone on, what has preceded that, is this great evolutionary process. And it's this march of man, where we've come from. You know, about 4 million years of time lapsing to go from the original hominoid, the origin of our Homo sapiens, to be able to come to where we are now. So I don't know if you can see it, but starting with, they're all biped, but our ancestors, of course, were quadrupeds, and our ancestors spent time in trees before they came down and then became biped in that way. But we're talking about maybe 4 million years of time lapsing to get to where we are now. So when we're talking about Harvey and St Eanswythe, we're just tiny fraction of time relative to where we arrived at with the mechanisms that we've got. Thank you. So, all that, by the way, the reference to Littlefoot was that in sometime in April there was the demonstration of one of our ancestors, a recreation of the skull. Were we able to see that? When we're talking about then the evolution of primates to the hominoid to Homo sapiens, we're talking about the fact that groups of these beings came together, and that these groups of beings needed a means of communication. And the means of communication was by developing the vocal tract, the vocal cords, but not using language. Language is, again, it's very fleeting in terms of its longevity. Perhaps 300,000 years we're talking about language being known as we using it right now, in terms of a conceptual framework and being able to eloquate, if you like, to speak to thoughts, to words, and develop language in that way. Before then, I would say we were involved in a whole process of modulation, modulating sounds. Remember when you came out of the womb? I'm here, okay? I'm hungry, I'm satisfied, and of course associated with facial features too. And of course, if you think about it, when you came out of the womb, largely mothers would actually react immediately to the sound, to the modulation. And because we've gone through this process of evolution to a biped from a quadruped, the only animal that has put down, well, with one or two tiny exceptions, the species on the planet is the human, who's actually put down separately because of the evolutionary process. The pelvic girdle's not sufficiently wide enough for the full-termed individual to be born. Notice next April, next March, you'll see the lamb come out of the mother ewe, get off, shake itself down, and very quickly get up and operate and live in that way. You noticed with your development it was a long time between coming out of the womb in actually being independent. It's a long time before you actually are using anything remotely associated with that idea of language. You're using sound all the time. Ah, ah. You're in trouble. Yeah? That cry then is the universal song. And that's where we come from there. So it's definitely the case that we have evidence, I'm pretty sure, that primates chatter. If you go onto a website and have a look at David Attenborough. Sorry, David Attenborough. Look at David Attenborough's series on primates, and you'll hear the baboons, the gelada baboons, chattering to each other, not using language but chattering. We can hear that. We can hear the evolution with sound. We can see that in fact sound is about emotion, engaging with another individual in that way. It's about aggression too. It's actually facial signs and sound to actually make warnings as well as being emotion in that way. Thank you. Now, when we get to our ancestors as close to us as we are now, really, we've got evidence that the neurological development of man, of Homo sapiens, was such that she wanted to say, I'm here. Remember, we said it, I'm here, with our universal song. Here, the Neanderthal is actually making a sign, making a symbol, making an image to actually say they're here, reflecting the world around them by using media, being able to reflect an environment. Now, it's impossible to assume, I think, that the neurological, conceptual development of Homo sapiens at that time was so advanced to be able to make images like that, so advanced to actually start to consider the connection between man, Homo sapiens as an individual, and something greater than, looking at the stars as an example there. It's impossible to imagine that there would be no sound being made, sophisticated sound, that modulation of sound happening in caves like that. And of course, this is a beautiful example of a cave. Listen! Because it's got reflective surfaces, because it's designed knowing that caves actually have an acoustic to be able to enlarge the sound that we're making in that way. So all our great medieval buildings to worship a god, are actually based upon the idea of a cave. Right? We'll create a means of actually amplifying the sound of our voices, which then is associated with text in that way, and so on. So, theory that it's impossible to think that sound was not as significant as visual art at that time. So we just go back to that one. We've got caves for shelter, caves for painting, caves for rituals, and caves for modulating sound. If you're interested in this whole concept, look at the work of Robin Dunbar, Oxford evolutionary biologist, sociologist, archivist, archaeologist, extraordinary man. And he has a number dedicated to him, which is 150. He says that groups are largely satisfied at that maximum number, 150. And as a corollary, it's impossible to have more than 150 friends on Facebook and know them, in that way. A very interesting idea that he brings forth is this, therefore, this sort of hierarchy of evolutionary process. And he says singing and dancing is the most significant element in our development. Secondly, it's actually the development of the language. And third is the development of, if you like, rituals and, as a corollary of that, religions. A hierarchy, those three interconnected, but developing into what we have eventually as being the most sophisticated examples of ritual, of dance, of song that we can find in our buildings and our social organisation. Thank you. So I've got a quote here, if I can find my book, from this man. Wonderful author here, Stephen Mifflin, who talks about singing Neanderthals. And he says this. He says, I want you to imagine this. Imagine a clearing in the African savannah, African plains. He said, at this site one should imagine 30 or more hominoids gathered together, males, females, infants, those of high status and those of low status, individuals, different personalities and emotions with resources to share and those wishing to consume some food. Emanating from the site would have been a variety of calls, reflecting the diversity of activities, how these change through the day, and the varying emotional states of individuals and the group as a whole. One might have heard predator alarm calls, calls relating to food availability and requests for help with butchery, mother-infant communications, the sounds of pairs and small groups maintaining their social bonds by communicating with melodic calls, and the vocalizations of individuals expressing particular emotions and seeking to induce them in others. Finally, at dusk, one should perhaps imagine synchronized vocalizations, a communal song that induced calm emotions in all individuals and faded away into silence as night fell and the hominoids went to sleep in the trees. So, that's a very lovely, it seems to me, a lovely picture, a lovely imaginary scene of how significant sound is in our evolution. So here we are on this side, on this panel here of Robin Dunbar's, if you like, hierarchy. Laughter, as we said before, singing and dancing, ritual and religion in those things. Thank you. So, sound modulation then, we're talking about those hominoids, eventually becomes the social construct, associated with language, associated with religion, associated with ritual in that way. Thank you. And at the same time, we've got this extraordinary development of the brain that's happening continually. And we know now that the brain is the great mechanism in our body, don't we? That everything depends upon the relationship between brain and body. And we know that when we activate the brain in certain ways, then we release these things called endorphins. And here's 4 of them: oxytocin, serotonin, cortisol, and dopamine, emanating from processes that are taking part in the brain. And when we sing, then, these hormones, these endorphins, which are associated with pleasure and pain, when we sing, we start to release these endorphins. We release these endorphins. Thank you. So, we're hardwired to sing. Everybody sings. Everybody can sing, assuming, as I am, about your physical condition, that you're there. It's an evolutionary process. It's about the modulation of sound. The modulation of sound associated with movement predicts language. And what it is to be human? To laugh, to sing, to dance in that way. Thank you. Very quickly. I'm going to need it tonight. Okay, just that. Okay. So, giant leap in time. Great leap in time. From 3 million years to the last 2,000 or so. And we've got this extraordinary idea, if you like, a triangulation of Western development. I've got to relate everything to the West at the moment. Where we are, the top is where we've come from, the apex of the triangle, to where we are now. So any point on that triangle in historical terms is actually going out. It's like a sort of a mass expansion. We can't stop what's happening. Let's just take the moon landing. Yeah, the moon landing. Less computing power to get to the moon than we have if you've got an Apple Watch on your wrist. So, an example of then this sort of magnificent expansion of knowledge and of experience in that way. So this happens to music the same. So we've got, on this side, we've got human evolution over 3 million years. We've got myths, legends, stories, rituals, religions. We've got an example of that, the wonderful discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls, spread of Christianity, 2,000 years or so, and Augustine arriving in Canterbury in 597 as part and parcel of that. On this side, we've got 3 million years of sound modulation. We've got sound modulation in the last 110 to 200,000 years, and we've got evidence of musical practice in our heads, and we've got evidence of visual practice in reality from caves and so forth. And we've got then, in the last 2,000 years or so, the development of singing and notation, how we actually capture that sound in that way. Thank you. Well, you've got your own ideas about music and definitions, so we don't need to worry around that. Let's just go up to the next. Thank you. But we have a connection between breath, singing, and health, our human condition. And it's been recognized for a huge amount of time. Here's some ideas from Plato. Music is a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life and to everything. Rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul. And will not our musician pursuing the same trail in his gymnastics, if he please, get to have no need of medicine, save when it's indispensable? Marvellous. Plato. Thank you. We'll just go on with something. So, jump again, another couple of 2,000 years to 1946, and the World Health Organization defining what is health. And what they said in their statute was that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. A holistic approach. Plato thinking that the human is about a holistic experience. World Health Organization similarly saying this. Yeah. 20 years ago, in this very town, across the way there, actually, in Church Street, what is now the new apartments, was in 2005, not quite 20 years, but this piece of work that my colleague and I did at Christchurch was about the perception of singing, the impact of singing upon ourselves as human beings. And in 2005, we established the Sydney Dehan Research Centre across the way there. The perceived benefits we found were associated with breathing and posture, were associated with social benefits, as spiritual benefits, emotional benefits, benefits for the heart and immune system, and benefits for well-being and relaxation. 6 years. And 20 years later, many more pieces of research have been concerned with trying to establish the relationship between a holistic approach to well-being and the importance, possible importance, of singing as part of that. Thank you. Yeah, so that you can see this afterwards. That's a really lovely reference to that. Thank you. And some of our publications associated with that. Evidence we can find absolutely in now taking that triangulation of knowledge. We can find means to look at the brain and see what's happening when we are singing. And these, it's very difficult to see, but you have to believe me. These are examples of views of the brain after somebody's had a stroke and after that person has actually been singing. And it shows that the brain reconstitutes, recreates connections that have been otherwise interrupted when a stroke has taken place with singing. Thank you. And finally, I just want to show you a little film of Amelia. Her name is Amelia Rose Hamilton. She's 30 years of age now. I've known her for 11 years. She came as a student to Christ Church. And she has had a very difficult life. She is perfectly happy for me to engage with you about the details of her life and to show you this film. But she was the victim of a terrible abuse. Her father is just still in prison right now. She was the victim of abuse by the state in the sense that so many organizations just didn't connect in that way. And she was a subject then to physical harm through a condition that's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a degenerative process which affects every element of your body, as well as being asthmatic, as well as suffering from a whole raft of other conditions. So a tough existence. She's so determined that she's at the moment actually in the second year of the second degree that she's studying. She took the first degree in music, and now she's doing a second degree in animal husbandry. Quite amazing person in this way. But she contends with regular, very severe physical and mental ill health. And nearly 2 years ago now, she had a when you get a very bad memory loss and amnesia, it'll come to me in a minute. Sorry, Sarah, that's not a very good description. I'll come to that in a minute. She was in hospital, and I took my guitar to see her, because I was going to some as well, and this happened. So this is just a little film of Amelia, and it seems to me to sum up, one, the human condition that music, singing is absolutely fundamental to us. Secondly, how you'll hear breath and her breathing is impacted by singing, and what that does then to the neural process that she's involved in.
Hello, Amelia. How are you? Amelia, just I'd rather see your face rather than your hand. That's it. Great. Lovely. How are you? Fine. Yeah, you're doing okay. Yeah. And you're never giving up. That's the thing. I think that song said, never give up. No. Okay, good. So how long have you been here? You know? Remember? going to do some singing now, are we? So you're going to sing. You're going to sing Yesterday. So I'm just going to try to put the telephone so I can play and you can sing. Then it's working perfectly well. Look at that. All the modern technology. Right. Beautiful. All right. It doesn't matter. You've got the tune. Okay, yesterday.
Oh, my trouble seems so far away. Now I guess that they are here to stay. Oh, yesterday.
Suddenly.
I know how the man I used to be. There's a shadow hanging over me. Oh, yesterday came suddenly. Why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say. I said something wrong. Now I long for yesterday.
Love was such a
Music came to play.
now I give the face to hide away. All I believe in
Yesterday.
Amazing.
3 million years and able to retrieve something there overcoming. So my last point is that I think we underestimate the power of breath, the power of singing, and its use in developing a harmony both for ourselves as individuals and in a social context, the world.
Thank you very much. Should we take questions? Should we do questions at the end? Because we had a late start. Are there any burning questions from everyone? Any questions? Would anybody like to put a question now? We'll have time for questions towards the end. Okay. Thank you very much, Grenville, for that. Amazing. Thank you.
My pleasure. Hyperpelagic.
Let's move on and hear from Sarah Montgomery, who's going to take us all the way into the modern era, or the early modern era of William Harvey. Thank you, Sarah. Do you want a microphone?
I don't know. Do I need a microphone? Or yes, I do. Yeah, provide me to do so. Is that better? Yes. Okay, that's fine. Then I will. And now, as I say, something completely different. Grenville, thank you so much for that, and particularly for sharing Amelia's story at the end. It's a wonderful lead-in, really, because I think I'm going to be coming at this from a very different angle. What Grenville's decided has been discussing is something quite intangible but vital to medicine. Whereas what William Harvey really concentrated on was structure and function. And of course, medicine works best when you can put the two together. I would say that my interest in William Harvey was really first stimulated about 2 years ago, when a doctor that my husband and I had met in India came to visit England. And he came to stay with us in Folkestone. Professor Sunil Abraham heads up the family medicine department of the Christian Medical College in Bangalore, Tamil Nadu, which is one of India's best known and highest regarded hospitals and medical schools, and a place where we've been privileged to visit and work many times over several years. And Sunil had never been to Folkestone, so we took him on a tour of the town, really to show him where I was practicing in general practice. And when he came to the leads and stood in front of the statue of William Harvey, he gasped, and this man nearly fell to his knees in homage before this great figure. And his reaction rather took me by surprise. I think to my shame, I don't think I'd ever really realised that William Harvey is more than just a figure of great historical importance in the history of medicine in England. He's actually a towering figure of global importance that 500 years after he first published his work in this wonderful little book, he's still recognised and revered across the world. And it's an extraordinary thought. And I have found myself having to ask the question, why? What difference does it make? I think we've got the wrong picture up. Can we sort of find a slightly different picture? No, back. Oh no, that's not mine. That wasn't what I said. No. Never mind. Doesn't matter. So I found myself asking the question, why? Why does it matter so much that William Harvey described the circulation of blood and the function of the heart? This is knowledge that we take so much for granted. We're taught it in primary school, how blood collects from the great veins, goes into the right side of the heart, is squeezed from the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary artery, into the lungs, returns to the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and is propelled right up the aorta and around the whole of the body. We take it so much for granted. Surely people could never have thought any differently, could they? Well, the fact that this knowledge is actually not self-evident was brought home to me very sharply a while ago when I was trying to teach some rather unruly community health workers who were refugees from Mali, from around the deserts around Timbuktu. I was trying to teach them about the importance of chronic diseases like hypertension. And I was well into my stride explaining how high blood pressure, if it's chronic and is not detected and is left untreated, is the silent killer, often revealing itself first of all through a crisis like a heart attack or a stroke. When all of a sudden some bright spark interrupted me and said, "So madam, what exactly does blood do?" And to say that this stopped me in my stride, really stopped me in my tracks, is a bit of an understatement, because it was a question I'd never been asked before, and it wasn't something that I had an answer to right on the tip of my tongue, and certainly not in French, which was the only language we remotely had in common. And it really made me understand that, or remember, that this man's worldview and those of his colleagues were really completely different from my Western educated brain, and that this was certainly the case for whatever concepts he had of health and disease and well-being and how the body functions. And part of the reason that it really took me aback was because because he was a Muslim from a nomadic tribe of camel herders who had herded sheep and goats and lived off their meat. And of course he would have killed countless animals in the approved halal way by slitting their throats and bleeding the great vessels. And he must have seen this blood, surely, shooting out and landing several feet beyond. How could he possibly not know about the concept of a pump and circulation? And yet, the view that he very likely had of how the body functions was probably quite close to that which was prevalent and the received wisdom when William Harvey first started his work. Really up until the time of William Harvey, concepts of health and disease and of how the body functioned were really based on the work of the 2nd century Roman physician Galen, and on the earlier work he himself had been very heavily influenced by Hippocrates. He was also heavily influenced by the Greek philosophers, by Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics, and he was incredibly well read in all the great libraries. So he was also exposed very much to the writings and scholarships that came out of Persia and Byzantium. And Galen had formulated a theory of how blood circulated based on all of that, but also on his own observations by dissection. But he was a little bit limited because at the time it was forbidden to dissect human cadavers. So what he had available was Barbary apes until it was decided that even they were rather too human for comfort, and so he had to move on to pigs. But he supplemented his knowledge from dissection by taking a great interest in the bodies of dead and dying gladiators, and in particular in their rather gory and extensive wounds, and he learnt a lot from that as well. Galen was really the first to describe or to understand that arteries are completely filled with blood, and there are gaps for air as well. And he was also the first to distinguish the difference between venous dark blood and arterial bright blood. And also, incidentally, he was the first to work out that the voice depended on the larynx, and he took great delight in taking a pair of bellows and inflating lungs to show how they filled up with air. But I digress. So, having worked out that there was a major difference between venous blood and arterial blood, Galen put this together and developed an understanding whereby he thought that venous blood, these two systems were completely separate and had different functions. So venous blood was generated by the liver, which he noted was connected to the gut, and distributed to the rest of the body through the right side of the heart. And its purpose was to bring nourishment and nutrition to the rest of the body. So it was consumed by it and had to be constantly regenerated by the liver. While arterial blood, being bright, was generated by the left side of the heart along with body heat and distributed by the left side of the heart again to all the organs of the body, where it brought life-giving energy, the vital spirit, if you like. There was no need for these two systems to be connected, and he had no concept of a kind of pump. Blood was drawn down to the other organs, kind of pulled, not pushed. And Galen integrated that finding with his understanding of the Hippocratian theory of the importance of humours, the which needed to be in balance and which were responsible for all sorts of ideas of health and disease, even mood and temperament. Too much of one of the fluids in one place, or too little, caused imbalance and was the basis of illness. Too little, likewise, would do that. Things could be too hot or too cold. And this is exactly the kind of thing that William Harvey would have been taught when he was a student in Cambridge and at Padua University, where he was considered to be an outstanding and exemplary student. He studied particularly anatomy, and when he graduated, he became physician in charge at St Bartholomew's Hospital with a service to the poor, as well as later royal physician to James I and Charles I. He also became the Lumleyan lecturer, where his job was to spread light and general knowledge about anatomy, enlightening both lay and other medical people. And so he did dissections of human cadavers by this time to general audiences. And for this, he wrote himself a set of little principles which gave a great insight into his character and showed what a wonderful teacher he must have been. And one of these principles that really struck me that he wrote was that he would never use words to explain what was best shown or demonstrated, so that he could allow people to see with their own eyes, make their own observations, and draw their own conclusions. And the thing about William Harvey, his genius, was that in his own practice, that's exactly what he did. He saw with his own eyes, and he drew his own conclusions. There's a universal adage that every medical student learns at university, and it goes like this: you see what you know. And for those that train as specialists, that acts as a lifelong spur to go deeper and deeper into their chosen specialty, so that when they come across relatively rare conditions, they're able to see them and make the right diagnosis. But for those of us who've stuck to the generalist path, it's rather more a warning to keep humble and alert, because there's no way that we can know in that depth about every body system at every age, which is what we have to deal with. All we can really hope to do is to see what is inconsistent between what we know and what we're seeing with our eyes and hearing with our ears. We have, if you like, to be constantly alert to our known unknowns, that which we probably did know once, but have long since forgotten and may have never actually encountered in our clinical practice. And our equally numerous unknown unknowns, that which, quite frankly, we've never known about. And to be able to spot those inconsistencies because they don't conform with the patterns of disease and knowledge that are embedded in the daily round of our practice. And that's exactly what William Harvey did. He didn't just accept and believe all that he'd been taught. He made his own observations. And where that didn't fit, he was able to see the inconsistencies. And then he conducted experiments to test out what he was thinking and reasoning and deducting from those inconsistencies and observations. And then he documented them in such a way that if others tried to reproduce his experiments, they would be able to do so. And that's basically the same method that has been used since that time throughout modern medicine. But it went against 1,400 years of belief and teaching. And so he knew that his ideas would have difficulty being accepted, and indeed they were. He was met with scepticism and cynicism, he was derided and abused. His work, something like 74 pages in 17 carefully written chapters, was described as that of a crackpot. And yet he stuck to his guns. And despite going through a time of great professional isolation and poverty, he did live long enough to see his ideas accepted, although it took 20 years for that to happen. And the amazing thing is that really, in some ways, nothing has changed since then. That is the foundation of all medical science and development to this day. It's really as a result of exactly the same methodology that developments as diverse as things like the end of the cholera epidemic in London when John Snow switched off a pump, to the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming when he noticed that something was not growing because of mold. And links us right to what's happened in these last 18 months with the rapid developments of effective treatments and vaccines against a totally new disease in COVID-19. So it really is not fanciful at all, and no exaggeration, to say that really the whole of modern medicine we owe to this incredibly famous son of Folkestone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Fantastic. Any questions for Sarah straight away? Would you like to ask something?
Originally, they did think the pump heart was pumping the blood outwards and it came back in again. So I think people were aware there was that motion there, but it was the going around that was the breakthrough.
I'm certainly no historian, and I would definitely, and I agree, they did think that, but they thought that it kind of moved independently. The right and the left side of the heart didn't beat at the same time, because you say you've got this kind of ebb and flow. One side had to fill up to let the other one go. And part of what led William Harvey to his conclusions was that he practiced vivisection as well as dissection, and he saw hearts beating in a variety of living creatures. So he could see that both chambers, both sides of the heart, were actually all beating simultaneously. They didn't have a wait to fill up. And so that to him meant there had to be a connection, a constant column that was going round. And he did all sorts of experiments whereby he filled up one whole limb, tying a little ligature around the top of the arm, let it all fill up with blood. And he realised that despite the fact the arm was swelling and blood was collecting there, the rest of the body didn't seem to be starved exactly, it was still being served. And when he let it off, it all went zooming back and that seemed to be absorbed relatively quickly. And so there had to be this kind of column of constant circulation.
Thank you once again, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. We're going to break now for some drinks, which are over there. So please come and help yourselves. Thank you.
Hemiplegic.
So I'd like to welcome you back to the second half of this fascinating afternoon. Apparently they didn't get me on the video, so they want me to say hello again. So and just to say again, what a pleasure it is to have you here in St Eanswythe Church, to welcome you to this space and to use it for such an interesting and fascinating look at who we are and where we come from and how we are also. So that's absolutely wonderful. I'm just going to hand over to Grenville because he's remembered his work.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had the word hyper on my brain. I couldn't get rid of it at that time. Amelia was suffering at that moment from a hemiplegic migraine. And my medical doctor colleagues here tell me now that in fact that's even more amazing what you saw, because a hemiplegic migraine means that she actually essentially was demonstrating elements of a stroke, so loss of memory, difficult functioning memory and so on. And yet what happened then was this extraordinary hardwired moment of actually just fitting in with that evolutionary process which actually went through that. So quite extraordinary. But she doesn't normally have problems with speaking like that now. Thank you. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you very much, Grenville. Good, so now we had figured in enough time to go and see Patrick Corrion's artworks, which is based on St Eanswythe's Way, but it was such a vile afternoon that come and see them when it's sunny again, as I think it soon will be. So we're going to go straight on with our discussion and finish earlier than planned. And our next speaker, so we'll have another talk and then we'll have some time for questions before closing. And our next speaker is Lesley Hardy. Please, could you welcome her? Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. That's two talks which are going to be quite hard for me to follow, and in what I say I'm going to try and draw out some of the themes that Grenville and Sarah have raised. But before I begin talking, I just want to ask you really, partly so that I know myself, how much you know about Eanswythe, how much you know about the project that we ran in Folkestone called Finding Eanswythe. Do people know anything about St Eanswythe, about the history? You know some of it. Okay, so, and I ask you that partly because what I don't want to do really, to be honest, is give you an archaeology talk. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian. I'm not well equipped to talk to you about archaeology in detail. But also, as I said earlier, I want to talk to you about something that I think runs through the Eanswythe project, runs through all historical projects, all history in fact, but also has a kind of deeper meaning, a meaning that overlaps with music and song and soul and heart and circulation, a meaning that actually resonates for all of us. I just say now as a pitch that if you would like to know more in detail about the Eanswythe project, Finding Eanswythe, John can help us here as well. We have some books which are the fruit of many hours of labour, I can tell you, and which are available for the extremely reasonable cost of £5, and all proceeds go towards the church, and in particular towards
developing the shrine of Eanswythe. Yeah, so everything from these books will go towards developing that honour the shrine.
So honouring and developing and conserving the shrine of Eanswythe. So all money goes to a good purpose. So if you are interested, do please avail yourself of one of these lovely books at the end of the event. Okay, so I'm going to move a second. Sarah? forgive me if it's a bit cheesy, but there we go. Not that I suppose it's easy to call T.S. Eliot cheesy, but T.S. Eliot, I'm going to begin with a quote from T.S. Eliot from Little Giddy, I think. T.S. Eliot wrote, "At the end of all our exploring, the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." Now, I'm getting on a bit now in my life. I've been fascinated and absorbed by history for all of my life, all of my conscious life. And as I get older, I look back at the patterns of my life, and I look back at the way in which history and the past has woven like a thread of gold through my life. And as you get older, you may agree, if you're my age or whatever, you may agree that as you get older, you begin to see patterns emerge that you don't see when you're living through them. And one of those patterns is really about the relationship between the past, as we understand and articulate it, history, for want of a better expression, and how we feel, what we are made of, which, as Grenville was saying so interestingly earlier, is we are hardwired to feel and to have a sense of the spiritual. It's there in our physical being. It's there in our hearts, as it were. And what I've come to see is that history is also deeply spiritual. It's emotional. It's about how you feel. It's about your imagination. It's about your spirit. And for me, that has a particular resonance because for most of my life, I have had two passions. One has been history or the past. Forgive me for talking about myself, but I hope you'll see why I'm doing this. And the other has been my faith. So I've been running the two concurrently for most of my life. On one side of my life has been my passion for history, archaeology, the ancient past, in particular the Romans. And on the other side has been my faith. As I get older, I see now that the two intersect, they converge, they are confluent like a river, like streams running into a river. They run together. And that particularly, actually, is the case with the Eanswythe project. But it's not just the Eanswythe project. So I want to just begin, if I may, by talking a little bit about earlier thoughts. So I don't know, Sophie, if you've got that picture of Richborough. Yes, there we go. Okay, so again, forgive me for talking about myself, but you'll see I hope the meaning of it. So when I was a small child, a very small child, I occasionally went to Richborough Castle. I grew up around here. I don't know if you know Richborough Castle. Richborough Castle is the most extraordinary, the highest standing Roman masonry this side of the Alps. And yet at the same time, it's in a remote, one might almost say bleak, spot. And I don't know if you have been to Richborough Castle, but it has the most extraordinary atmosphere. When you go to Richborough Castle, and the walls you see before you are actually mostly late 4th century, so they are a late building on top of the much more extensive and complex Roman site. They're defensive walls that were put up around a central part of what had been an expensive settlement. But when you go to Richborough Castle and you step inside those walls, you feel the past. You feel it. It's like almost visceral. And when I was a small child, I used to occasionally go to Richborough Castle. And one of my great and secret delights was to scrape away the bits of concrete from between the stones and pocket it, stick it in my pocket, and then take it home and worship it. Because to me, it was something that was a tangible connection with the ancient past. I couldn't get over the idea that, to my childlike mind, without the complexity of nuance, I'm not thinking of it quite this way, but that the Romans had touched, built, mixed, slathered on, and watched set this piece of concrete. It was absolutely entrancing to me. And here it was, I could hold it in my hand. And that sense of the imminence of the past, that sense that the past, that if we only just allow ourselves to feel it, the past is there, is very strong in some places. Stronger in some places than in others. And that was always a thing that I was interested in and alert to. So that's me as a child. And then when I went off to university, I began to understand that there were languages for this. There were languages that talked about this feeling that I had from history. I used to have a really wonderful history lecturer when I was at university, a man called Alan Hawkins, who sadly died a few years ago. But I can remember Alan saying to me, Lesley, what you have to remember is this: history is not all about change. It's not all about one thing after another. It's about the deep patterns that persist. It's about continuity. It's about how things stay the same as much as about how things change. And then when I was a bit older, later I was doing my PhD, I had a conversation with another fantastic cultural historian, a man called Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall said to me, Lesley, it's all about tradition. This is what you have to understand. History, in a way, is about tradition. Not like tradition as in folk song, Morris dancing, all that. Tradition in the sense that in society, in culture, what we do is we hold on to some things and we shape them into something that we find. We inherit ideas, objects, beliefs, understandings, feelings, I would say, and we keep them and we make them familiar to ourselves. But some stuff we jettison. So we keep some stuff, we lose some stuff, and the stuff that we keep, we pass on. Because it has particular meaning to us. And as we pass it on, just like in that radio program where they pass on songs that are meaningful to them, as we pass them on with the meaning that we have given them. We have coloured them, we have shaped them, we have imbued them with meaning, and we pass them on. And so it's like a golden chain, as the Elizabethans used to say. It's like a golden chain of meaning that goes from one generation to another. In the church also, as I came to learn, just to explain, all of my life I've been a historian, I've been a history teacher all of my life, and researched and written history. But then when all of my life also, I've been thinking about the church and wanting to go into the church. And in fact, I put off going into the church in order to complete Finding Ainsworth. So, but I am now actually, although it seems, a priest. curate at least. So I'm like an apprentice priest. So when I started doing my training, I learned that the church also has a language for this. I'm going to have to just go back to my notes to make sure I get the word right here, because I am not always very good at words. And John will help me, I know, if I get it wrong. Here we go. The word I'm looking for is Anamisis. So the church has a word called Anamisis, which sounds a bit like amnesia, but it's in a way the exact opposite of amnesia, because it's about remembrance. It's about how things are remembered, and in particular for the church in the act of communion, in the act of the Eucharist. It's about how we reenact the last, or not reenact, but we remember in the act of the Eucharist, in the Mass. But it's more broad than that, I think. I think it's also about how we remember. The church is deeply, deeply committed to the idea of remembrance. There's a very fascinating book, I'd recommend it to you if you haven't read it. It's an interesting book. It's a history of Christianity by a man called Dermot McCulloch. And at the very preface of it, he says, he actually quotes a church historian who says, the whole church is about this treasure. Christianity is a treasure that we pass on from one generation to another. It's a treasure. And here we are in a treasure house of remembrance. So the church has this language, history has this language. So if we can just go to Folkestone. No? There we go. Is there an old picture of Folkestone? No? So what brings me to Folkestone? I'm getting around to it slowly but surely. So what brings me to Folkestone is this idea, this passion I had, this interest I had in history and what it means to people. This feeling that some places have a particular sense of history. I'm trying to understand that. And Folkestone is one of those places. If you live here, you are very fortunate, because Folkestone is an ancient and fascinating place, and it has layer upon layer upon layer of meaning and history. And what brought me specifically to Folkestone was a project that we ran in the old High Street, which we called Folkestone People's History Centre. I was working for Canterbury Christ Church University, like Grenville, and we wanted to set up a history centre. And one of the first things that happened was we opened this little shop. Somebody came in and said to me, "What are you going to do about the Roman villa?" And I'm like, "What Roman villa? I didn't even know Folkestone had a Roman villa." And I came to understand, this is in 2005, I came to understand that Folkestone not only had a Roman villa, it has an extensive Iron Age and Roman settlement, which we then spent about 10 years on and off excavating. And when I was preparing these notes, I was very struck actually between the overlap between the Richborough photograph and this photograph, although this photograph less so than the old photograph I had. And there are patterns emerging. So that was what brought me to Folkestone. And I understood in that process of that work, it was a project we led, we ran in Folkestone called A Town Unearthed. Some of you will have been part of that project, some of you will remember it and have been part of it. And it was a jolly good project, if I say so myself. But yes, we learned something about remembrance in Folkestone, but we also, frankly, learned about forgetting. Because a lot of the history of Folkestone was forgotten. And in fact, even after we excavated this site and exposed it, it had been excavated in 1924 by a brilliant archaeologist and classicist called S.E. Winbold. And then it had been recovered up in the 1950s to save money. Even when we re-exposed it and we'd done all this work and research on it, people still forgot it was there. And people went back to the story about Folkestone basically being a fishing village and a place of smugglers and Edwardianness. They forgot this deep antiquity. But all the while, waiting, undiscovered, as it were, or waiting, as it were, to be rediscovered, was Eanswythe. So we finished with the Iron Age, we finished with the Romans, and then round about the same time that I was thinking about going into the church, we began to think about Eanswythe. And Eanswythe was lying here in a small niche at the back of the church, which you can go and see if you don't know it. I'm sure it's okay to go and look at that niche. And she was resting in a lead reliquary, which was actually made of probably Roman lead coffin panels, and which had been remade in the Anglo-Saxon period, probably actually after her death, and into which she had been placed, probably again sometime after her death. Well, obviously sometime after her death, but probably actually 100 years or so after she died, at least. We know that Eanswythe was venerated in this place, on the Bale. She was venerated here in the late 8th century. She was being venerated here that time ago. So that's a long time. That's a long time. Eanswythe, for those of you who don't know, just very quickly, Eanswythe was an Anglo-Saxon princess, Kentish royal family. She died probably sometime around about 650. She lived, in one account, all of her life, but she certainly spent some time, we know that now, she spent some time in Folkestone, possibly some part of her childhood in Folkestone. And she founded a minster here, probably on one of the houses just behind us over here. And that minster was an important point. I can answer questions about this later if you like. But it was an important point religiously and culturally for the emerging and growing Christian culture in Kent. And she died there. When she died there, she was somewhere between 17 and 20 years old. She was not much more than a child. And very soon after her death, within 100 years or so, probably, of her death, she began to be venerated. And if anyone's interested, I can tell you more about that process and how people venerated and why. So, so this was a really interesting thing. And when we turned our gaze on Eanswythe, am I going on to? When we turned our gaze on Eanswythe, we didn't just want to look at the kind of the history and the archaeology of Eanswythe in a narrow sense. We wanted to bring all of this stuff that I'm talking about into play. We wanted to understand what Eanswythe had meant, how it was that this tradition of Eanswythe had been passed on, this treasure of Eanswythe had been passed on from one generation to another generation, as it had. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if you come from Folkestone, you should be so proud of this, because it is almost unique to have an Anglo-Saxon saint enshrined, venerated in the place where she lived and died. All of these hundreds of years she has been here. That is, I think, unique. So, we wanted to think about how that had worked, what had happened. Who were the people who had remembered her? The Anamisis of Eanswythe. And what we found was, over 3 or 4 years, what we found was this extraordinary story. a story about, yes, Eanswythe's Minster, and Eanswythe herself, I should say, is very hard to get to as an individual. We know very little about her. But we wanted to kind of colour in around the edges. So we found out a lot about Eanswythe's context, the context of the Anglo-Saxon Kentish royal dynasty, the world into which she came and in which she had significance. We found out about how her life and how her legend was etched into the landscape. So we've already talked about, Joanna has mentioned, the Watercourse. Now, at the beginning of the project, we didn't know about, we knew that there was this watercourse, but we didn't really know a lot about it. But we now know a great deal about it. We know its exact route. It starts about, it actually begins as a natural flow of water from the downs, and then it comes down, and then it goes into a man-made aqueduct that carries water for about 1.5 miles into the town. And you can still see the channel of it as it comes out of the back of the primary school here and then down onto the pond. It probably originally came up Church Park, past the florist and up that way. I fondly, being a Romanist, I thought it must be Roman. And my friend Andrew Richardson, Dr. Andrew Richardson from Canterbury Archaeological Trust, he said no, his inclination was no, it was Anglo-Saxon. But we now know actually it was neither of those things. It's medieval. It's probably 12th century. And it was probably built actually at the same time as this church in order to serve the community for which this church, this was their church, the priory that was here. So there was this watercourse. Then there was a lost chapel. We didn't know about that either. We had hints of it that we found in 19th century antiquarian writing. And then when we actually looked into it, we found, yes, there probably was a chapel dedicated to Eanswythe up on the North Downs Way. We found incredible documentary evidence that gave us a lot of insight into the veneration, not just of Eanswythe, but other saints in this church. We found, for example, one thing I find particularly interesting is this idea, there's this idea that sometimes relics are, a man called David Rollison says, relics are articulate. So relics speak. And there were some speaking relics, and they were particularly, the shape and form of them was expressive. And Eanswythe, fragments of Eanswythe relics were kept in something called a head reliquary, which is like imagine a precious metal bust with probably jewels on it. Eanswythe had a head reliquary. That head reliquary was probably almost certainly melted down, the jewels plucked off it and sold. And we learned all about that and what happened. We learned about what happened at the Reformation, that devastating act of vandalism in the 1530s, and what happened. And at some point, probably in the 1530s, Eanswythe's relics, her bones, were taken and hidden in the wall here. They were hidden in this extraordinary act of bravery, and that is what has preserved them. So it is an extraordinary story. It's a really, really wonderful and extraordinary story. So what have I learned, just to wrap up? I've learned that history is a personal thing. History is not, sometimes we're taught at school history is objective, it's all about fact. History is not objective. Even if we try and make it objective, that effort of making it objective, that we strain to somehow make it scientific, that etches itself onto the history. It goes against the grain. History is personal because it is the work of people. It is the labour of people to tell about themselves, to recount their own lives, as I have done this evening, the lives of others, and to pass that treasure on. History is deeply personal. I have learned that. I have learned that there are patterns to history. I've learned that you need to look for the patterns in history. And you need to approach the past with an open mind. You need to look beyond the material. Sarah said something about what she learned at medical school, about how you see what you know. And I think that's true. I think actually you already know what it is. You feel what it is, and then you see it. Then you rationalise it. Then you articulate it. Then you turn it into a story. I think the feeling and the sense of things comes first. And lastly, I think that if you want to actually understand the past, you have to be open to the idea of speaking to the dead. And I don't mean that in anything like a sinister way. I think you have to understand that past, present, and future run together. And we have to actually embark, as Grenville was saying, when he talks about the resonance of the voice, we have to understand that we speak, we resonate, our voices resonate with their voices. We have to listen to them and in turn interrogate them. As the Renaissance historian Petrarch did when he wrote imaginative letters to dead Romans. You know, my dear friend Cicero, this is how it is. We have to imaginatively engage with the past. We have to stop being so reductive about the past, and we need to open our minds and our souls to the past. I'm going to just finish with another quote, and this is a quote by a very great historian, a social historian called G.M. Trevelyan, George Trevelyan. It comes from his autobiography. The poetry of history lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men and women, as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone. One generation vanishing into another, gone as utterly as we ourselves shall shortly be gone, like ghosts at cockcrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Thank you, David. Do you have any questions? Yes, please.
I just wondered how the bones were found. You said in buried in the wall.
You repeat questions we didn't hear.
I wondered how the bones were found after they'd been buried in the wall.
How the bones were found? Yes, well, there are others here who can probably answer that with greater depth than me. But in brief, they were discovered during the beautification of the church. So, as you'll see, much of the beauty of this church is Victorian. And at one point, the chancel was being lined with alabaster and having other decorative work done on it. And in the course of that, workmen found a kind of niche, a kind of hole in the wall, and below it a kind of slab of alabaster, a slab of stone, which they lifted up, and below it, in the church walls like this are built of rubble. So they have their stone and with the rubble filling. And in the rubble filling was this casket, which was very battered, actually. They took it out, and inside were these extraordinary bones of this young woman, which you can see here. And when we were in the church, looking at these bones in January of 2020 on a night not dissimilar to this, and you can see the fragility of these bones, and you can see the sense of this young woman. You had this extraordinary sense, really odd and extraordinary and powerful sense of her presence.
Yeah.
social side. And like Lesley, I have a feeling of history, and I've known this church since the 1950s. It has an atmosphere. I believe the technical term is numinous, spirituality, whatever else. But I just want to make this observation that in the world of today, which is increasingly obsessed with its future, how can we hang on to the valuable things you've taught us today about the past, lessons we've learned, stories we've articulated, to help us through whatever faces us and our children and grandchildren? The problem isn't an answer, but
it's to my mind, history is not a muse for nothing. We have to understand that if we reduce everything to the material, if we reduce everything to what is profitable, what is functional, what has utility, we lose ourselves.
that's tied up so with the point I made about creativity.
Yeah, no, I think we stand on the shoulders of giants. Essentially, we can only we learn from Bridgebrook because it's there. We can develop on that, and exactly the same with ideas. The fragility and the temporal nature of music is such that it took such a long time to be able to capture it, either by writing it down or then, only within 100 years of actually recording it. But we've actually been standing on the shoulders of this evolutionary giant in ourselves, and then in the last few centuries, or 2 millennia, 3 millennia, in terms of our Western tradition, being able to access what has gone before. So I just say, if you want to stand on the shoulder of a giant in ideas and what the future could be, come on November the 20th, when a magnificent practicing musician called Rachel Podger will be playing the music of a giant of J.S. Bach on one instrument, which actually represents, at that moment in time, an absolutely fundamental summation of technology that has never been surpassed. So the technology stopped, but the ideas went on. So Shostakovich could write the same instrument. So I think, we have giants around us and we respect them. And there's a giant.
I think it's important to remember that William Harvey didn't just pull his ideas out of nowhere. He never pretended that he was doing something entirely new. He built on the foundations of Galen and the others, but what he did was to test them. So he did a series of his own observations and experiments that actually tested it out, and that which was found to be good and solid and sound, he retained and added to. And that which didn't stand up in the light of what he was seeing, he made logical, reasoned deductions from and found them to be inconsistent and set that out and explained why, and then moved on. And I think that's possibly one thing that we need to do, is to actually take what is good and solid and sound and test it out in the conditions of the day. And some of it will be really valuable, but some of it won't. And discerning that is perhaps one thing that we can build on.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you all for your really inspirational talks. I'm really struck how you talk about memory, really big common theme, particularly Grenville. Important, you told us that word and you remembered it. And I just wondered, really, I want to bring it back to the artworks, which are what are bringing us here. And I was very struck when you were talking, Sarah, about William Harvey thinking about the statue and this new statue that's facing it, and how these things kind of memorialise people, and art kind of reminds us of things in the the art that we were doing with Hugo, I don't know how much it was art, but we were singing. Somehow it was art in our terms. It was giant, but it was the beginning of art. It was fantastic. And really, it's a question for Lesley, because you were talking about the Watercourse. I'm just wondering, Patrick Crillion's work, because the weather's so foul, we couldn't see it. I'm just wondering what your views are on how that might help us remember, memorialise, and how art in general helps us remember and memorialise the past as we go into the future. Picking up a bit on what Ian was talking about. Just returning to art, because that's really kind of what's behind all of this. Whether you have any thoughts about that Watercourse and those houses that remind us of the connection.
Thank you. When I look at Patrick's work, I'm actually very struck with how much they are like, and I'm sure that he's actually given this a lot of thought. They are very resonant, and they're very similar to actual reliquary shapes, medieval reliquary shapes. And I think again, there is a resonance. When we see that, we may not actually intellectually always necessarily understand that, but there is a resonance, there's an echoing there. So in that specific sense, I think his work is really interesting and important, but in a more general sense, it is of course simply, I sometimes think of it as like, I don't know, imagine some kind of alpine fantasy where you have people echoing, yodeling or whatever, echoing from one valley to another. He is simply etching or echoing or making a sound which people will hear in the future. They'll look back and hear that echo and that resonance and see it, and it's like part of a chain.
Any more questions? One more.
Oh yes, I think to answer your question, paraphrasing Churchill, if you don't study the past, you don't study history, you will repeat it. And I think that's the key point. Is many of us feel that's probably the world we're heading towards another disaster, but we're not going into specifics. My one question, Dr. Hardy, was you said that history is spiritual. What do you mean by that? Is the Second World War spiritual?
The Second World War is not history. History is the writing of the Second World War. It's the way in which we interpret it and understand it. And there's always in history a deep sense of the search for authenticity and meaning, and that is what is spiritual.
Thank you very much. Grenville, are you going to say anything about that?
No, I'm just thinking it was a lovely response.
It's a lovely way to put it. So, I think we'll close. Thank you so much for coming and being cold and staying with us. It's been so interesting. Thank you, all of our three speakers, for engaging in such complex ways with our themes, but also in ways expressing those in ways which we could all take in and understand. So thank you very, very much for coming, and thank you all as well.
I'd just like to add my thanks again for coming here and using this space for such interesting explorations. Also just to say that Grenville mentioned the concert by Rachel Potter. If you're not aware of the series of concerts that we have here, by Bale Music, which Grenville runs, then there are leaflets that I put out just at the back of the church there on the left-hand side. If you don't know about the Bale Music concerts, take one of those. The other thing is that we still live in the heritage of Eanswythe, especially here in this church community. And if you happen to be interested in meditation, the kind of Benedictine practices that she would have practiced in meditation, something called Lectio Divina, which is a certain way of using readings to open our spirit up, then there's also some leaflets there about the companions of Eanswythe, which exists to both promote the shrine here, but also to promote some of those spiritual practices. You don't have to be a churchgoer or even actually a Christian to be involved in that. And then also to say that on the right-hand side there are some of those booklets that Lesley mentioned about finding Eanswythe. Leaflets are free, books are fine.